All right, hello everyone. Glad you could join us today. I'm here with Fawn, and we also have Herman, which is HK on Discord.
Mhm.
And the three of us are part of the active countermeasures team. We also have a whole host of folks in the background, as you may have just seen on the pre-show. They are helping out as well, so we thank them for that. Uh, this is episode 6 of our monthly webcast about command and control, this command and convo, the C2 webcast. And today we're going to discuss how the software Velociraptor can be used maliciously as a command and control channel. And Fawn has put together a great presentation on this to share with all of us. So thank you, Fawn, for that. And we want
Yeah,
this to be an interactive webcast, which includes all of you watching this right now. So we appreciate your questions and comments in Discord. And we have changed venues in Discord for our chat. So the chat now is in the Black Hills InfoSec Discord in the live chat channel. And you can find a link to that in Zoom on the resources button. If you click on that resources button, you'll see a link to the BIHS InfoSec Discord. And we welcome you to join that if you're not already a member there. That's where we're going to be doing all the chat. And I'll be monitoring that throughout the webcast. And I'll try to bring up as many of those questions that I see in Discord as I can during this session. We are not using Zoom for chat and QA. So please don't post your messages there because we don't want to miss anything. We'd rather keep everything in Discord. That way we can interact with everyone there. So yeah, we appreciate that. And I'm looking forward to this as well, Fawn. Thank you for putting this together. And I guess let's kick this off. And Fawn, I guess
awesome.
let's talk about dinosaurs, dude.
Let's do it. I did see some people drop Velociraptor GIFs in the chat, and
Yeah.
I've seen them all. I really handpick the best ones, but I appreciate all the Jurassic Park shoutouts. That kitchen scene is definitely a classic. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Uh, let's go. All right. So, by the way, I really appreciate this picture. I think they had AI complete the Velociraptor. I just love that it's pondering with its hind leg, actually. I thought that was a neat detail. But yes, welcome. Like Keith said, we're going to talk about abusing or misusing Velociraptor C2 today. I also want to say thanks to all our old viewers and also welcome to all the new viewers. We really like to hang out on a Friday and just chat about interesting malware communication and malware communication techniques, and then kind of think about how to threat hunt it, right? I always like to start off with just kind of like getting a map of the terrain, just so we understand what we're going to cover today. So the first thing I want to do is I just kind of want to set some context, zoom out, like conceptually. So we just kind of understand like what's actually going on here, more on kind of a macro level. Then I'll talk about what Velociraptor actually is, which kind of segues neatly into like why is it being misused as a C2? Like what properties does it have that's so favorable for it to be used as a C2? Then we're going to go into a short little actual live demo, which will be a network threat hunt. And then we'll come back and do an endpoint threat hunt. I'm going to quickly cover some high-level hunting recommendations. And then we'll conclude with kind of a take-home message. So context. So as well, those of you that don't know, this is kind of like my mascot or my power animal for my presentations. It's called Lead Cat because you can see his grill. But I have a massive surprise for you guys. I'd like to debut a special version of LeadCat just for today's talk. Chana!
Oh man, you
It's a chimera. Yeah.
Fawn, you successfully took a very creepy image and made it much more creepier.
Yeah. You're welcome. I think we'll just use him today because he's pretty rough. But anyway.
Yeah, well, when I wake up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night, I'll thank you for that, Fawn. Appreciate it.
So the first thing I want to kind of ask is, again, this is context, just kind of setting. Why do threat hunters even need to use C2? Like, what's the point of C2? And so to really kind of frame this properly, let's consider what a threat campaign looks like really on a high level, right? So on a very high level, a threat campaign has a start or a beginning, and it has an end, right? And the start is typically initial access, right? And initial access, how I always like to think about it, is getting one's foot in the door, going from having no control or access to a network to having some control, right? Now, typically, it's not all the control they will need, but it's basically an opportunity to further towards the end, right? Now, this can obviously take a whole myriad of different forms, whether it's public exploits or phishing, supply chain attacks, things like that. But the point is that they go from not being on the network to being on the network. And then the end is just literally a different term for achieving their goal. Now, again, this can take a myriad of different forms. Maybe it's a nation state actor, maybe it's the gathering threat intelligence or something like that, espionage. But more than often today, it really is related to perhaps some kind of extortion. Because at the end of the day, what the adversaries really want to do is they want to be able to count their bitcoins, right? And so to go from initial access to achieving their goal, there's actually this kind of like massive gulf in the middle. There's all these other things that need to happen. So what are these other things? How do they go from initial access to achieving their goal? Well, as many of you probably know, there's a whole variety of different things. It can include or not include one or more of the others: lateral movement, enumeration, exfiltration, persistence, pivoting, privilege escalation, defense evasion, credential harvesting. Just some random examples. Most campaigns will probably include some form of them, but there's no set pattern, right? So it really depends on what their goals are, what the environment is, what their kind of knowledge and speciality is, and all of that. But the one thing they all kind of have in common is that mostly, almost always, in order to perform all these other actions, remember, you're now or the attacker is on an external host. They need to now do it on a host on the local network. So in order to do that, they need some form of command and control. But when I say command and control here, I don't mean like C2. I don't mean a command and control framework. I mean literally they need commands. They need to be able to run commands, and they need to be able to exercise some form of control on the endpoint. So now when we think about what a C2 application is, or command and control framework is, it just kind of happens to be the most convenient and explicit expression of fulfilling that requirement. And it's because, of course, it evolved. There was a niche, an open niche in the ecology, which was we need to do this thing. So people created software to do that thing. And then it was probably a very obvious name to give it because that's what it's supposed to do, right? To provide command and control. But now, and this is increasingly true, it's not the only way to obtain literal command and control. Now, the thing is, when it started out, so, when, let's say, threat campaigns became a real business, maybe late 2000s, early 2010s, when crypto kind of came and ransomware and all of that, initially, obviously first the Metasploit days, and then really when Cobalt Strike came around, almost always exclusively they use C2 for command and control, right? But over time, this changed. And why did it change? Why did it diversify? And the main reason is, as all of us now in security know, there's this kind of perpetual evolutionary arms race between attackers and defenders, right? One side innovates, the other one has to respond, etc. Ad infinitum, right? But here specifically, we can say that it was really the adoption of modern NDRs, and especially, I think, EDRs that are so effective that really made it hard for attackers to just go ahead and use their little cracked Cobalt Strike, completely non-customized, and still get away with it, right? Any properly secured environments will probably have the detection to immediately flag that, or even just block it outright. So now again, in kind of like evolutionary terms, this placed a selective pressure on attackers to innovate, and it caused them to find alternative means to reach the same ends. And so they adopted a whole variety of other options. Now, what are these other options? I'm going to discuss them in terms of, I want us now to think in terms of categories, right? So the first thing is, obviously some protocols that we all know and use and love inherently provide some level of command and control. And that could even perhaps be how they got initial access, or they could be inside and then they're able to password spray or exploit a different kind of service, right? So some examples, SSH obviously provides some level of, between SSH and ACP provides some level of command and control. Probably the best example, I think, is RDP. Publicly misconfigured, publicly exposed RDP ports or services are still a huge initial access vector too. And so think about it. For any of you that's ever used RDP, I mean, it's essentially like you're sitting in front of the computer and using it, right? So amazing command and control, really. You just have a window inside of the system that you're operating on. And VNC and other kind of protocols, right? Then something else I want to point out is living off the land binaries and scripts. So I'm just going to quickly run over the definition for those of you that don't know what it is. And this is taken directly from the project's website. I think Herman will share it. And it's kind of created and maintained by a dude named Mr. Docs, who has a lot of different projects going on and is definitely somebody worth following. Certainly an interesting and pioneering individual in the malware development space. So LOLBAS has to be a Microsoft signed file. It has to either be native to OS or you can download it from Microsoft. So a great example there is psexec, part of sysinternals. Doesn't ship with Microsoft, with Windows, but you can download it officially from the Microsoft website. And it has to have some unexpected extra functionality. And what I mean there is, in the kind of classic hacker mindset, you can leverage one of its properties to provide a functionality it isn't expected to provide. But here specifically, that extra functionality really has to be beneficial to an adversary or a red team. What are some examples of this? Well, I already mentioned psexec, consider WMI, and then classic PowerShell as well, right? And there are many more, and I encourage you to go check out the website. But those are some of what we could probably consider the big three. Then a whole other category that I feel has really been making recent waves. I've really seen a lot of it involved in campaigns in 2025 and so on, is RMMs, which stand for Remote Monitoring Management. Now, so for those of you that have no idea what this is, the best way to kind of think about it is it's kind of like RDP, but RDP on steroids or RDP with added benefits. And, MS RDP, that's obviously a Microsoft service. These are private companies, so you buy this service. And what makes it different from RDP is, for example, it's not really for diagnostics or individual, it's more to do with fleet management. So one person can control many remote hosts. The other thing is it works in the background. If you take over a system with RDP, it basically like locks out. So an individual would be able to see somebody else's RDP'd into that system. So RDP is kind of, like I said, more for access, whereas RMMs is more for management. So what are some examples of this? Very good example is Screen Connect and AnyDesk. TeamViewer was kind of a classic. It's not as popular anymore, but still being used. And Synchro. And there are more examples. I think Screen Connect and AnyDesk probably is the bulk of attacks I see, usually one of the two of them involved in. I just want to kind of plug here DFIR report. It's one of my favorite online resources. They have different honey nets. So actual attackers attack their infrastructure, and then they write incredible reports. But the reason I'm mentioning here is you'll see there are many attacks where RMMs are involved. And many times it's actually that they won't just use an RMM. They might use Cobalt Strike or another C2 as well, but then as well use a RMM. I think especially if they're able to discover that the company is already using a specific RMM and then use that as another channel, it would be something that would be incredibly difficult to detect. And for those of you that aren't as old as I am, this is a reference to the New Kids on the Block, which were like one of the early 90s boy bands. And the reason I'm using it here is to say that now we have a new kid on the block, which is using Velociraptor as C2. But what's interesting here is it's not just a new software or application being used. It's kind of like the emergence of an entire new category, right? It's the weaponization of live forensic and an incident response tool. Because again, obviously, as we said, the goal of a lot of threat actors is merely to get a payday. They don't really care if what they're using is considered malware or elite or anything like that. Anything that can, to some degree, allow them to achieve their goals, they'll use, right? Yeah, it's kind of the same thing. So then what is Velociraptor? Well, Velociraptor it was initially open source application and it was later acquired by Rapid7. And I'm not just saying that to drop some facts. Keep that in mind. It's actually like it's part of the story in a sense as well. But it really markets itself as being used for digital forensics and incident response, but it could certainly be used for threat hunting as well. And Eric Capuano and Whitney Champion, who are kind of like part of the BHIS tribe, they often do a workshop, or I think maybe an entire course, using Velociraptor for threat hunting. And they're big fans and proponents. So it is an amazing application as well, when used responsibly. So what makes Velociraptor unique? What's kind of its secret sauce? Well, first, I just want to kind of context set. Again, let's just really understand the difference between what is a query, what is data, and what is results. So imagine we have two systems. The system on the right has data, and the system on the left, it doesn't want the data itself, but it wants to know something specific about that data. So it'll send a query, and then it will return results, some information about that data. So for example, data might be sysmon event ID1, which is when a process is created. The query might be, hey, did winword exe spawn cmd exe in the last 24 hours? And then the result might be, yes, there was one event. Here's the timestamp, here's the PID, PPID, etc. Right? So if you think about how the different kind of architectural designs in terms of how to do forensics, kind of initially in a somewhat clumsy way, perhaps, is that the data lives on the endpoints. There's a system that has a question, they have a query. So all the data gets shipped to this same endpoint. It just runs the query locally and it gets the result. Then kind of an improvement on that was to actually use a specialized central server for gathering the data. So same kind of idea, but this time we're going to introduce a server. All the data gets pushed to the server. The query is now sent to the server, and the results are sent back. And our option C is kind of the unique innovation of Velociraptor. So think about the system we just spoke about. Now there's no more need for a server. And the querying system could be local, but it can also be remote, right? It could also be external to the local network. So now when it has a query, now instead of pulling the data stays on the endpoints. So it actually sends the query to the endpoints, and all it does is it brings back the results. So Velociraptor uses client-server architecture for real-time data collection. And you can run query and analysis on multiple endpoints, and then you can centralize the results and artifacts on the server. So it can run commands, it can exfiltrate data, it can upload data, it can bring system memory back from a remote location. The shell commands it can run, also it can run PowerShell, it can run CMD, and it also has its own querying language called Velociraptor query language. Like I said, it can pull the entire operating system memory. It can also pull individual process memory, right? So hopefully a lot of you can see that if we strip away the specific labels about it being used for forensic, it really has incredible capabilities for attackers to run post-exploitation operations, right? So, obviously, if you can dump the operating system memory, you can get LSAS, you can do credential harvesting. There are many, many things you can do. And for those of you, oh, it's coming, sorry. So this, like I said, kind of segues us into using it as a C2. So this person here, Vincent Huey, he was very prescient because in 2023, he actually tweeted this, which was, hey, you should use Velociraptor as a C2. And then about 2 years later, which was August of last year, we have Sophos XOps publishing the first report of a confirmed incident involving Velociraptor being used. So I'm going to quickly kind of, from the attacker's point of view, lead you to what it is actually like using it, and to further reinforce why it's actually pretty amazing as a C2 framework. So when you set up the server, you are going to basically give it all the configs you want the agent to have, like, for example, the server's IP. And then you're just going to generate a MSI, a classic Microsoft Windows installer, and it's going to have all the configs in place. So you can just copy that onto the endpoint. It's pretty easy to see how you could perhaps attach that to an email, and a gullible person that doesn't know better would, please install this antivirus update or something like that, might run it, right? It's not a weird ISO, it's not a macro or anything like that. It's double click, and it will install itself. So also just to show you when I was doing this, this is very rare for me. I almost always have Defender completely disabled when I do my things. But here I actually wanted to try, and Defender was enabled while I did this. So like I said, an MSI installer, you double click it, you have this little pop-up there. You don't even need to click next. It literally pops up, does this little thing, and then poof, it's gone, because it's now running in the background as a service. And now on the server, if we look, we can see here that we have a client that checked in. We have some information here, host name, etc. And in fact, we just out of the gates already get a lot of other potentially useful information. And then I don't want to go too deep down this rabbit hole, but this will be relevant in our threat hunt in a bit. Let's not say we as the attacker, we want to run a command on the endpoint, like I showed you, PowerShell, CMD, VQL. Let's just run the classic who am I? And here is the result. And let's just kind of zoom in on this result. This is another crazy thing about Velociraptor. Like I said, it runs as a service, and it's a trusted utility. It comes with a certificate. So you essentially get auto privilege escalation, like out of the box. This guy's name is Brian Almond. He's got an amazing channel called The Weekly Purple Team. Incredibly nice, concise little walkthroughs looking at how to attack and then how to defend. I highly recommend you follow him on YouTube. Cool. So let's get hunting. And today we're really gonna follow the adage, network for breadth. So we start by looking at the network to get a kind of bird's eye view. And then when we see something suspicious, we're gonna zoom in to the endpoint using Sysmon primarily and WL to get a little bit more depth. So we're gonna do a live demo. And then for the endpoint, like I said, we'll get back and we're actually gonna just do a presentation for that. So network threat hunt, just before I start, I do want to shout out this entire threat hunt is based on a Malware of the Day article I published in September of last year. So you can go there, you can read it in more depth. And as well, the PCAP and the Zeek files are there if you wanted to explore it yourself. And for those of you that are new, So today's episode 6. In episode 4, I actually guided people through how to set up your own threat hunting lab. So if anything that I ever do, you wanted to go and recreate it and hunt it yourself afterwards, which obviously we always highly encourage, then please go check that video out. And I'm sure Herman has probably already dropped it in Discord or will do so shortly. But yeah, let's go do our live demo. So live demo, here I am in Rita. And so I've now opened the, it's processed Zeek log files essentially. It wraps its a layer of abstraction on top of it, and it's going to basically correlate different data and interpret it for me, right? And so you can see here that this second entry, it's kind of interesting, kind of right off the bat. There are a few things going on here. So let's just kind of touch on some of the things. Obviously, the first thing is Rita will use a number of different kind of data points to assign a severity score. Here we can see it's not a huge data set per se, but it's one of 2 that has a high severity score. Here you can see the local machine, obviously, and here's the destination. And the destination here it's connecting directly outbound to an IP. Now there is, I forget, but there is a minor, it's a technique or a sub-technique, it's probably a sub-technique that is specifically for this, right? Direct connection to an IP. So it is something that not by any means this is 100% malicious, but it's kind of like interesting, like what's going on there, right? Next, we have a beacon score, and the beacon score here is 0. Which kind of makes us wonder, well, why does it have such a high severity score? But if we look at the connection count here, it says 1, which means this is just one long perpetual connection. And that makes perfect sense that it has no beaconing score, because beaconing is all about the intermittent connection and disconnection and the specific like diagnostic pattern that can come from that. Here we have the duration. Now, for our, once again, this data set is from Malware of the Day. For that, our intention is to provide a 24-hour PCAP from which one then derives the Zeek logs. So nothing here will ever be longer than 24 hours, but you can see here it essentially spanned the entire 24 hours. But just remember, if you're looking at live Zeek sensor data, this could potentially be 40 or 60 or even more, right? But whenever we have a very long running connection directly to an IP, and we can't necessarily correlate that internally to a business need, once again, it's no smoking gun, but it's cause to look closer.
Hey, Fawn.
Yes, brother.
Hey, Linux Girl has a question that I didn't want to just answer on Discord because I'd like everyone to hear it as well for you to answer.
Yeah.
But she's asking, why is the second result scored as high when the beacon rate is 0%?
Yeah, so that's because, like I said here, the connection count is only 1. So it means it isn't a beaconing connection, it's a perpetual. It's one long continuous connection. So we also have to remember that a beaconing connection is one thing that could potentially be suspicious, but it isn't by any means the only way in which a malicious connection can take place, right? And in fact, in many ways, I think one could make the argument that the original connections were all just long persistent connections. And then one of the kind of innovations, remember what I said, the co-evolutionary arms race. So then it became quite easy for people to just see, hey, there's a 100-hour connection here. What's that about? And then one of the innovations one could say was beaconing. And then maybe even on top of that then was introducing jitter to beaconing, right? So you don't have the exact same connection period each time. So it's purely because of that, Linux Girl. If I maybe go down one, and you see here it has somewhat of a high beacon score, not terribly high, but you can see immediately the connection count goes up, right? And that's because now there were connections and disconnections, essentially.
Cool.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Does that make sense?
Thank you, Linux Girl. That was a good question.
Cool. The other thing I want to touch on here is prevalence. Now, prevalence here isn't that relevant because there was only one local host. This was a simulation that I ran. But prevalence becomes interesting if you're looking at an actual network with many endpoints on the subnet. Prevalence is another way of just, I guess, using some simpler terms, a simpler term for what's commonly called least frequency analysis. Now, least frequency analysis can be applied to many things. It can be applied to a process or a connection here. And what it basically says is, look, if I have a local network, let's say with 100 systems on them, and there's only one system on that of those 100 that's making a connection out to this host. Like, why is that? That's interesting to me, no? Because in a typical corporate environment, you would expect more or less them to connect outbound to the same hosts. Now, maybe sometimes there's 20 of them that are connecting to one specific host, but I would say certainly if there's only one or maybe two, it is once again no smoking gun, but certainly a cause to look at it a little bit closer. And then the last thing I want to touch on here is just the port. The port here is 8000. It's not it's somewhat of an unusual port. It's not an extremely unusual port. It's often associated with some development servers, like for example, Django uses it. At the same time, it's once again, we have to ask, is there a business need for development server? Why is something specifically reaching out to 8000, right? It's not a default port per se. So today, I'm not going to jump into AC Hunter today because it's basically going to show us the same thing, because in AC Hunter, we won't see any histograms today because, again, this is a long connection, right? So there's no bar graph. There's no histogram to show here. But today I wanted to share this with you guys too, because it's one of those cases where, like I said, high severity, direct to IP, long connection, potentially, let's say, low prevalence, somewhat unusual port. There's a lot of things that makes you kind of go, but there is certainly nothing that would warrant you alerting a response team at this point. So like I said, network for breadth and our endpoint for depth. So this actually can now kind of give us cause to take the time to like zoom in closer, to look at the endpoint and see if we can maybe find something there that gives us some more reason to be concerned about this connection. So endpoint threat hunts. Before we even start, I just quickly want to touch on the difference between a process and a service, right? And it's a false dichotomy, because they're not two different things in the same category. It's two different categories. A process says what something is. Service relates to how it is managed. And in fact, almost always a service is just a specific type of process that is managed by the Windows Service Control Manager to run the background. So it's a background process. For those of us that work with Linux and Darwin, it's sometimes referred to as a daemon or a daemon. I don't know, Keith, do you say daemon or demon? Do you know?
I say Damon, but I don't know
Daemon.
if I'm
Okay.
right either. So
Okay. Daemon from like a golden compass, I guess.
yeah,
A daemon, right? So it's just something that's happening in the background.
because when I think demon, I think like some creature that lives,
Like Beelzebub.
thing.
So almost all services run as a process. And that's interesting for us because that means Velociraptor is both a service and a process. So it means it runs at both. And this is cool because both have unique diagnostic value to us, which we're going to see now. So I want to detect it both so we're going to go and see if we can find it both as a service and as a process. And to detect it as service installation, we're going to be looking at Windows event log 7045. And then to look at it as a process initiation, we'll look at sysmount event ID 1. Let's start with first looking if it's installed as a service. Why is that? It's not arbitrary. It's because typically on a host, there are way more processes being initiated than there are services being installed. And so obviously, if we're trying to find something, we have two different data sets, and one is a much larger data set. We should probably start with a smaller data set. It typically makes our lives easier, right? Like I said there. So now when we ran, I showed you guys we ran the MSI installer, right? But there is still, even though we're looking at the GUI and seeing a little pop-up box, there's obviously still a command line. Oh, no, no, no. Sorry about that. I just got a call. There's obviously still a command line invocation happening on the system. So when we ran the MSI installer, this is actually what the command that was being run on the system. So now we might think, well, how can we use this as a detection vector? And maybe the first thing is like, oh, well, let's just look for velociraptor.exe. But those of you that kind of understand the pyramid of pain and the idea of, brittle versus resilient, this is obviously a very brittle detection vector. Why? Because they could rename the file, right? The file could be named anything. So typically, a general strategy is we want to target things or want to utilize logic in our detection vectors that's harder to change. And in this case, they have to use the flag --config, and they have to point that to a YAML file. Again, typically it's called client.config or by default, but they could easily rename that. So we won't use that in our logic. So now we can formulate the following PowerShell query. So I'll point out the specific parts we want to worry about. 7045, like I said, this is WL7045. And then here, that's really the hearts of our detection logic, where I say we're looking for something that includes --config and a YAML file, right? And so when we run this in our data set, we get the following result, and we can see there indeed the service name Velociraptor service, and we can now see the time it was created and the command line. So using WL7045 to detect service installation was, like I said, it's useful because we're looking at a smaller data set. But the real cool part about this, though, is that it's pointing us directly to the client config, right? Why is that cool? Because the client config contains the IP address it's connecting outbound to. So this could now be an opportunity for us, if we saw that suspicious connection in Rita, to correlate that with this connection. I also want to point out that we could also potentially, after we find the PID, use sysmon event ID3 to also find the network connection. But this, I feel, is kind of like something just served on a platter to you. It's a very easy win. So like I said, we looked at service installation. Now let's look at process initiation. And I'm not just doing this to do this or to be redundant. There is actually unique value that's being offered here. We're going to get additional information here. So let's have a look at our query script this time. And you can see this time, not WL7045, sysmon event ID1. And now hopefully this looks familiar. We can see again config, right? And service run. Remember, we run the process, the binary, and we provide arguments. And one of the arguments was service run or find a YAML file.
Hey, fine.
Now here at the bottom, what do I want? This is one of the beauties of PowerShell. We can say exactly what fields we want to output to terminal. What is it? Well, I want the name of the process and the arguments. That's just to kind of confirm that we're looking at what we want to. And then the PID. And the PID is really where the magic starts happening, right? So let's have a look at our results. So once again, we can see the suspicious process. And we can see the arguments. The arguments was, of course, what we were just looking for when the service was being installed, right? But now here, critically, we get the PID. And the PID is, in this instance, 11420. So now we have the PID. Cool. Now what? Well, if we have the PID, we can ask many things, but among them, and probably the most important thing in my mind always is, what other processes were spawned by this PID? If we know what this PID is, and we say, if a PPID, a parent process ID, equals this PID, what child processes were spawned by it? And so here you can see we're still going to be looking at event ID1 because we're still looking for process creation, right? We're just looking for ones that were created by Velociraptor this time. And our PID of 11420. And we're saying, show us the child process, the command line, and the user. And here are results. Same thing I'm showing here as what's available there. I'm just kind of zooming in. And of course, when I showed you the demo, I said, let's just run who am I using CMD. And here you can see CMD was run with who am I, and once again, running as system. And we can obviously use this, potentially see if that in turn spawned other processes and stuff like that. This potentially opens a whole web that you can go crawl to find all the information. But I just wanted to show that kind of like obvious immediate next step. I also want to mention that this might seem now that we're perhaps veering outside of the domain of threat hunting more into forensics. And probably in most circumstances that would kind of be true. But at the same time, I also think like if you are in a situation where, let's say, Velociraptor was actually allowed to be used legitimately on a network, but you had suspicion that it was also being used illegitimately, if you're able to see what exact commands were run at what time, for example, that will give you the level of granularity that would allow you to be able to potentially differentiate between legitimate and illegitimate use, right?
Hey, Fawn.
Yes.
Question. Going back to searching for the YAML file, ABH4T is saying, can they not rename the YAML to any other extension if the file format is still compliant with the expected input? I guess that would still work, or question mark?
I don't want to guess, so I can't tell you that 100% for a fact. It might not. I encourage you to go test that. A lot of times anything, as well, when we say resilient, it doesn't mean, when I said this is a more resilient detection vector than renaming, than changing the name, it doesn't necessarily ever mean it's like it's a bulletproof, right? With enough ingenuity and knowledge, I'm sure any attacker could maybe even change the source code and recompile it in a way where it has the config built in, for example. Right? It's just about by decreasing the probability that the attacker would have done something, it increases the probability of the detection working. Right. So that's kind of more the trade-off or the dynamic that I'm thinking about at the heart there. But like I said, I couldn't answer you for sure. But interesting question regardless.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, and I'm kind of with you, Fawn. I mean, just purely changing just that one file's extension, I would assume is not going to work. So it would take further work, like you had just mentioned. I mean, you would literally have to go in and change some code in order for, the whole process to still be valid, I would assume.
Yeah, I just don't know. It depends on the Velociraptor installer whether or not it requires YAML or it will accept something else. But again, obviously, attackers and hackers in general are very smart and ingenious. So there's always a way to figure out how to hoodwink stuff, right? But I appreciate the question. It really shows you kind of are thinking like a hacker, and that's a great way to always, whether you're approaching it from the offensive point of view or defensive, that allows you to think, how could they actually potentially bypass my detection vector here, right? So good job on that.
Yep, agreed.
Oh, and if anyone else knows the answer for sure, please feel free to share with the rest of the community. Thanks. Cool. So we're coming up towards the end here, friends. So let's share a few hunting recommendations, super high level. For network threat detection, look at persistent connections to 8000, 8080, 8888, and 5000. All of them have been correlated with Velociraptor use. And now, obviously, when we say something like this, the first, very legitimate critique is, well, they can use any port, and they can use any port. But as we see kind of time and time again, is a lot of them don't. A lot of them don't change default values. And maybe it's only 10% or maybe it's 50%, but you're immediately just going to sift out the dregs there, remove the lowest common denominator. So why not, right? I again want to remind us about the modifier in Rita, which I think is a very useful modifier, which is first seen. So if we see something that started recently and it's long running, Again, something to definitely pay some attention to. It does use TLS by definition, so we can't really fingerprint, like, for example, the HTTP headers, unless you're using DPI. But you could probably consider maybe using something like JAR4. It obviously depends on whether or not the servers are known to threat intelligence as well. And then, as we see many times, as well as looking for persistent connections to public cloud infrastructure, understanding whether or not that does correlate internally with an actual business need. And then endpoint threat detection here is really where, you know, the grainy pixels come a little bit more in focus, and things, I think, become a little bit more clearer whether we're dealing with a threat or not. But we want to look at Windows Event Log 77045 service, Sysmon Event ID 1. Like I said, our more resilient detection vector logic here would be looking for the -- config and the YAML file. And the kind of like unique value proposition of the two different logs that we looked at is Windows Event Log can point us to the YAML file. The YAML file has information about the server. And the Sysmon will give us the PID, and with the PID, we can go and find a whole host of other information. So my one kind of take-home message today is to get a little bit philosophical or velociraptorical on you guys. I want you guys to kind of consider this and this kind of quote. And, you know, one very useful, I think, guiding principle to have in your minds now, especially as attackers leverage more and more legitimate software, is don't put all applications strictly in a category of this is definitely legitimate and this is definitely evil. Malware and non-malware. I don't care about non-malware. I care about malware, right? We see this with a lot of legitimate tunneling applications as well, like MSDev tunnels and things like that. So an application can be good or bad. It depends on how it's used, right? And what was interesting to me here was it actually even went a step further, because it's actually it's just kind of like a tragic irony that an application that was created with an express purpose to protect systems is also extremely powerful in for abuse by attackers, right? So the line between malware and non-malware will continue to become increasingly blurry as we go ahead. Cool. So I want to talk about some of our future C2 webcasts right now, so you can save the dates. The next one will be on the 20th of February next month, and I'm going to be talking about DNS text record abuse, especially for those of you that I think the third episode was on DNS Cat 2. So we really looked at, you know, using encoded subdomains for agent to server exfil. That's kind of like the ground floor of how DNS can be used as a covert channel. Here we're going to go like one layer deeper. And so I'm excited about that. If you didn't see that webcast, or if you want to have a refresher, it's obviously right on the Active Countermeasures YouTube page. And then this one I'm especially very excited about. Troy did mention the article he wrote last month about an interesting case that they found. So this one I'm going to hand the mic over to Troy. And Troy is actually going to present for us that specific case, about the curious case of the Comburglar. Comburglar. And again, what I think is really cool about that, guys, is, you know, a lot of my things are theoretical and conceptual, and it's simulations I run, and it's what could a threat actor do. But Troy is going to be reporting on what they found an actual threat hunter do. So I'm really looking forward to that one. And then the 1st of May, I just changed this. I don't want to, it might just kind of be a normal malware of the day, but I am also working on something pretty cool and special and unique and different. And it all depends whether or not I can get it to do the thing I want it to do. But that will be on the 1st of May. Also, just note here, please, we're actually taking a break on April. There's something happening there. So we'll be back then in May. Cool. Thank you. I hope your guys' experiences were unforgettable. And we have quite a bit of time for questions, so yeah, feel free to ask away.
Hey, thank you, Fawn. Yeah, I
Cool.
don't see any questions now, but of course we're keeping an eye on it. But thank you for that, because it really, I think, gives us all a lot to think about, myself included. Uh, and and I think an important takeaway also from this, from a perspective of being a threat hunter, is that even though reputation and the validity of certain software is important, obviously, that I think more weight needs to go to the actual behavior, right? So in other words, just looking at something and saying something like, "Oh, well, it's Microsoft, it's safe," is probably not really the best mindset to have. You really need to look at the behavior of those connections and if that's expected in your network. You following kind of what I'm saying?
Absolutely, and more. If some of you guys want to go look at the malware of the day I did on Google GC2 as well, you're seeing traffic to Google Drive. You're not going to look at, oh my God, they're communicating with Google Drive.
Yeah.
Call the cavalry guys. No, that's like, totally expected.
Yeah.
And once again, just keep it's cool learning details here, and that's valuable. And I think also details change over time, but a lot of principles stay, right? And one of these things, just to kind of keep in mind, like I said again, the perpetual co-evolutionary arms race and more nuance results all the time. And that means we have to have more nuance in our way of thinking and detecting as well, right?
Mm.
And to answer your particles, yes, we have PCAPs and the pre-generated Zclogs for all the threats that we run. So if you go to Active Countermeasures malware of the day, Herman will drop a link. It's an article, it's a report, and at the bottom you'll always find 24-hour PCAP and Zclogs to go do it yourself. And then, like I said, we did the webcast, how to set up the whole environment yourself, the one that I use at home. One step even that you can go beyond that then is to run the simulation yourself and generate the attack. And for those of you that have never played around with Velociraptor, whether you want to play around with it from, wearing your red hat or your blue hat, it's a super awesome tool. So please go and do that. It's definitely something I think that could potentially have a lot of value for people on their journey.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I do like how you pointed out that, that like the reputation of Rapid7, which is very good. It's certificate signed, all the
Yeah,
signs, on the surface look fine, but we can't
yeah.
assume that just because of that, that it's okay. You know what I mean? Uh,
I'm
yeah,
glad you brought that up because I said, oh, that's going to become important to our story. And then I totally skipped over it. But why it was important to our story is it was first an open source project. I don't know if they had a valid signed certificate. Maybe not. But then they're required by this big, multi-million dollar company. So then it's very easy for them to get a legitimate signed certificate. I'm talking about the process certificate now too, right? Not the X509. And that's one of the reasons that you can just install it as a system, like get Previsk, off the bat. So I find that interesting too from a, I don't know if this is going to sound pretentious, but like phenomenological point of view is that the fact that it got acquired by a fancy company means that it's actually more effective now as a offensive tool, So that was a cool little detail for me as well. Thanks for reminding me about that.
cool. And this, there's a question also from I'm sorry if I'm mangling this. It's Rodrilia, I believe. And this is kind of beyond our scope, but I'm just going to throw it out there anyways. Is any thoughts on
Mhm.
how to prevent Velociraptor from being abused? And like I said, that's kind of beyond our scope. We don't really get
I
into.
don't know if Jeff McJunkin is still in the chat. I saw him in the beginning, but something tells me that dude has got some not serious knowledge bombs to drop on that. So Jeff, if you're still around, feel free. But really, one thing that just comes off right off the bat is if you are not using Velociraptor in your environment and you're able to have a blacklist or a whitelist of what you are allowed to use, like easy win. I know, again, there's the ideal and the real. What I'm expressing now is the ideal. I know, things get very messy when you want to translate it into companies, and there's politics and old machines and a lot gets factored into that equation then. But at least in theory or in principle, that's something you can immediately just consider is don't allow the process to be able to run immediately. I also think that, look, so the Windows system that I showed you guys that I had Defender off, it's a Windows 10 machine, and it's not, I don't allow it to reach out for any updates. But at the same time, it is certainly possible that since there was this kind of wave of Velociraptor abuse, that it wouldn't necessarily be so easy to run it anymore, right? So maybe, right? Cool. Thanks, Jelly Beanster. Yeah,
Yeah,
I agree with
and thank you
brother.
all for the thanks. Oh, we greatly appreciate that. I mean, I see that in Discord, and I love seeing that. So thank you for saying thank you. We really enjoy doing this, and we really enjoy the engagement as well. And we appreciate you spending some time with us on a Friday. And we're glad that you were here with us today. We look forward to the next one, and we look forward to seeing everyone there as well. I'm going to throw a link in Discord, a link to subscribe to us if you want to receive email notifications of our blog post and our upcoming webcasts. And just to let you know right up front, we're not going to spam you. We're not going to send you a bunch of sales junk. It's just purely notifications of our blog posts, like our malware of the day and associated threat hunting blog posts and these webcasts. So feel free to go ahead and sign up for that. That way you'll get notified of upcoming events as well.
Yeah. One more thing, I just want a special thanks to, first of all, for the BHIS team, Jason and Zach and all of them for accommodating us. We're so happy to be part of your guys' initiatives, and that, being here gives opportunity for our community as well to take part in these cool things and get some sweet gifts and loot and stuff. Because our community is your community and vice versa. So it feels good to be merged back in. And the other shout out is to Herman. Thanks, Herman. Herman is HK in Discord. He's always there, always helping, always sharing links. We always appreciate you, brother, and appreciate all your support. Thanks.
100% Vaughn. Thank you. Yep, you just said pretty much everything I would want to say as well. So we appreciate everyone. So thank you. Cool. We've reached the top of the hour. I think we can all continue our Friday, and some of us have to work and some of us don't. But either way, we're going to enjoy the rest of the day. And thank you again, Vaughn, for a great presentation. Thank you all for your involvement here, and thank you all for being in the background to help keep this going. So thank you very much.
Thank you guys very much for sharing your knowledge with us today. And yeah, thank you to the audience. Appreciate y'all. Hope
Awesome.
y'all have a great day, and
thanks.
next week.
Happy hunting, everyone.
Happy hunting. Ciao, friends.